Hello, it's me, Christine. Welcome to my little crime corner. I have never been fishing before, and maybe the everything about me tells you that. I have a friend who has a whole Facebook dedicated to his fishing adventures. Every picture he posts looks the same. Anyway, I do get how this can be a calming and relaxing activity. Of course, in order to be calming and relaxing, you would hope your fishing trip isn't filled with anything out of the ordinary. On June 20th, 1984, two fishermen were fishing in the Spokane River right by the TJ Minich Bridge when they saw something strange floating in the water. They got a little closer and were shocked by what they discovered. It appeared to be a woman's torso. Her head, hands, and feet had been removed, and they were not found in the water. Police were called, and the remains were removed from the water and transported to the medical examiner. A medical examiner from nearby King County came to Spokane to perform the autopsy. Although key identifying factors couldn't be tested, such as fingerprints or dental identification, the medical examiner found several characteristics that would hopefully point police in the right direction. There was notably a scar on both her left and right knees, a scar on her inner left bicep, and two moles on her neck above her collarbone. At first, it was thought that the victim had been in the water for 48 hours. However, after noting the temperatures that the water had reached overnight, at one point dropping to 48 degrees over the past several days, it was believed that because it had been so cold, this halted decomposition, meaning she could have been in the water for as little as a few days to as long as several weeks. During the autopsy, the medical examiner had found evidence of sexual assault with a blunt object. There were several bruises found on the lower portion of her body. There was also what appeared to be a piece of tape still wrapped around the upper portion of one of her arms, although much of the stickiness had worn off due to being in the river for a prolonged period. While examining the severed points on her wrists, ankles, and neck, it was first believed that this was possibly the work of a serial killer, as dismemberment was typically not part of a first-time murder. The fact that her head, hands, and feet were removed were noted as an obvious attempt to conceal her identity, which was a strong indicator that she had possibly known her killer, and they had gone through great lengths to make her unidentifiable. Based on the cut patterns, the weapon used in the dismemberment was most likely an axe, hatchet, or a large hunting knife. An early lead at the time pointed investigators to Gary Ridgway, who was known to have committed the Green Mountain murders. Although occurring in the same state, and the victim having suffered sexual assault, the similarities ended there, and investigators were unable to find any connection between Gary Ridgway and this mystery woman. In fact, there were no other murders known to have been committed in or around the Spokane area around the time of this murder with similar circumstances. The method was so shocking and violent, this heinous crime stumped police. If you recall, her time of death proved difficult to determine, as her prolonged time in the water delayed decomposition, which also made it difficult to pinpoint her accurate age. At first, she was believed to be between the ages of 30 and 40, but upon further examination, her age was confidently estimated to be closer to 25 to 35. Based on the length of her torso, she was determined as having a medium build, and her height was estimated to be 5'7". Based on her torso measurements, her likely weight was estimated to be around 130 pounds. There was a possibility that she was blonde, as the few body hairs found still attached were very light in color. This, along with her skin tone, led investigators to believe that she had Scandinavian ancestry. A forensic dentist had determined that she had had dental work done shortly before her death. Her pelvic bone indicated that she had given birth at least once, and because of her estimated age, it was a very real possibility that this was a young mother who had a family in the area. This wasn't so specific enough to know who she was, but it was at least a lead. A little over a month after this mystery woman was found in the river, a dog in the Rimrock area brought home a severed human hand in an advanced stage of decomposition. It was highly suspected that this hand belonged to this woman, but with no fingerprints to compare, local investigators had to send the hand to the FBI in Washington, D.C. for fingerprinting. Having these prints didn't really do anything in terms of moving the investigation forward, since they had nothing to compare these prints to in the first place. Nonetheless, these prints were kept on file in the event that a possible identification could be made at a later date. 14 years later, on April 19th, 1998, a Spokane resident was walking their dog around 7 p.m. near a vacant lot, specifically on the corner of 7th and Sherman Street. This person thought they saw something strange in the corner of this lot. As he got closer, he kicked around and sifted through a pile of debris, only to find what very clearly appeared to be a human skull. Not something you would expect to find. Very troubling. Police were called, and the investigation started promptly the following morning. Police brought in several people to help excavate the lot, and actually found several other bones, but they appeared to be from a different body than the skull. Further testing on these bones prove that they did not belong to this skull. During initial examinations of the skull, investigators were unsure if the skull were male or female, and the condition of it made it difficult to pinpoint an age. There weren't any marks that indicated anything obvious in terms of cause of death. At this point, they just had this skull with not much else to go on. The only thing of note that would have made a difference in terms of giving police a clue was that there were 2 vertebrae attached. For obvious reasons, this was now considered a homicide. At first, investigators thought that the skull might have belonged to a victim of Robert Lee Yates, since he was known to have been active in Spokane at the time, and this lead was further pursued. After investigators found no connection between him and this possible victim, they were back at square one. The vacant lot where the skull was found had previously been home to the Sharon Temple Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. That was a mouthful. The church had been demolished in 1989 after having been vacant for several years before. The first thing investigators did upon finding this piece of information was to look into the property to find out if there had ever been a graveyard there. Really fast, just in case it comes up, if it's affiliated with a church, it's a graveyard. If it's a standalone establishment, it's a cemetery. I'm telling you this because you never know when you'll find yourself in a cash cab. So they looked into the graveyard possibility, which would explain the several bones that they found. A brief investigation determined that there had not been an attached graveyard, which makes the appearance of all these bones all the more mysterious, and also troubling. Since the church's demolition, the lot was in disrepair and became a spot where a lot of children from the neighborhood would gather and play after school and on weekends. It was kind of cluttered with wood and pallets and stuff like that, but at one point it had a treehouse and a swing. Every few years, a volunteer group would comprise a cleanup crew, but it would never stay that way for long. The last the area had been visited by a group to be cleaned up was late 1997, so a year or so before the skull's discovery. 2 years later, in March of 2000, the skull was used to create a reconstruction. The reconstruction was then passed along to law enforcement all across the northeastern United States, and while doing an examination of the skull, medical examiner George Lindholm found that there was a distinctive angle on the dismemberment wounds. The two vertebrae found that were still attached to the skull was the key in matching the sever wounds to the torso. It was this discovery that prompted the testing in order to determine that the skull came from this torso. They were then able to confirm that the skull did in fact belong to the torso found in 1984. Since so much time had passed, many of the original investigators had since retired, but all of the files and evidence on the case had been kept and was available in the event that a break would reveal itself in the future, and now it has. Following this confirmation, the torso of this woman was then called to be exhumed from her resting place in the Fairmont Cemetery in Spokane. The detective that was in charge of the case, and therefore the remains, a man named Don Geis, had transported the skull from where it was being held in Washington and had taken his 10-year-old daughter with him. After a day of driving, they had stopped at a hotel for the night, and his daughter said, "Since we have another person in the room, we should name her. Let's call her Millie." Since then, this mystery woman was referred to as Millie Doe. After the exhumation, Millie's DNA was submitted to the state, national, and international databases, hoping to find a relative. Early on, the FBI also uploaded her DNA and information to Canadian databases. They thought that since Washington State and Canada share a border, it is very likely that this woman was possibly Canadian, and they were hoping to get a match there. A woman from New South Wales, Australia, contacted police in 2004 because she believed that Millie could possibly be her missing daughter. However, after comparing her DNA to Millie's, she was quickly ruled out. The tape that was found on her arm was sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab in 2006 for testing. They were hopeful that some DNA could be pulled from it, but because it had been in the water for so long initially, and the integrity of the tape had since deteriorated in previous years, any testing done on the tape to extract anything did not yield successful. Remember that hand that was found by the dog? Testing did reveal that it ultimately did not belong to Millie. The hand was actually lost sometime during its processing, so even if they wanted to re-examine it, there was no chance of that happening. How do you lose a hand? Like, how? Who would see this and, throw it away? Who is going to the place where this is stored and, switching the labels? If this wasn't Millie's hand, who was it? I don't know. It's gone now, so I guess we'll never know. A forensic artist named Carrie Stewart Parks created another facial reconstruction based on the measurements of the skull in 2007, and a more comprehensive article was submitted to a local newspaper called Spokesman Review. At the time of the article in 2007, Millie Doe was the only unidentified female in Spokane County. Investigators received a tip in 2015 that Millie could possibly be a missing woman from Blythe, California, who had disappeared in 1980, who was last seen in Ehrenberg, Arizona, which is only 6 miles away, literally just over the California-Arizona border. It was noted that she was last known to have been seen with a local biker gang. This tip was brought forward by the missing woman's sister, who had submitted her DNA to compare. This woman also said that her sister had had a son who was an infant when she had gone missing. This would have been consistent with Millie, as her autopsy had shown evidence that she had given birth at least one time. DNA tests confirmed that this woman's missing sister was not Millie. In September of 2021, samples from Millie's torso were taken and sent to Orthram for DNA sequencing. A profile was created, and genealogists were able to put together a list of potential family members, which they shared with the Spokane Police Department. The DNA sample had helped investigators locate a public record for 2 sisters, where it said that it was possible that Millie was one of those sisters. At first, it had turned up that both sisters were deceased, but a deputy medical legal death examiner that had been working with the Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office had found out that the younger sister, named Deborah, was still alive, and she was living somewhere in the Midwest. Deputies with the Oklahoma City Police Department's cold case unit were able to locate her, and she was more than happy to provide a DNA sample. The Spokane police were able to narrow down the list, and on February 17th, 2023, were able to positively identify Millie Doe as being Ruth Bell Waymeyer. On March 29th, they released this information to the public. Ruth was born on April 16th, 1960, which would have made her 24 at the time of her discovery. Ruth graduated from Rogers High School in Spokane in 1978 and grew up living between Spokane and Wenatchee. After her mother had passed away, Ruth and her sister Deborah had grown apart and were estranged in their adult life, having never reconnected. It was determined that Ruth had never been reported missing in the first place, as she was known to have lived a transient lifestyle. When thinking back on their childhood, Deborah fondly remembers how close they were. When they were young, their parents were married, and their mother would stay home and look after them, while their dad went to work as a furnace operator in town. Their parents ended up divorcing when the 2 of them were in elementary school. The girls continued to live with their mother, while their dad still worked and provided for them. That was until he got married and shifted his focus and attention to his new family. Over time, they saw their dad less and less, and eventually lost all contact with him. During this time, their mother had been diagnosed with cancer, and they spent the majority of their time in the hospital. Despite all they went through, Deborah always knew that she could count on Ruth to stand up for her. She recalls one time when she was being bullied on the school bus, and a classmate had ended up hitting her over the head with some books. She remembers Ruth stepping in and putting the bully in her place. In 1981, their mother had passed away, leaving Ruth and Deborah essentially on their own. Unfortunately, this caused Deborah to drop out of school. They drifted apart when Ruth got married. Very shortly after the 2 had tied the knot, the relationship soured. After that relationship, Ruth started bringing this other guy around, and that relationship moved fast. The 2 quickly decided to get married and move. This was strongly advised against by Deborah, who felt they didn't really know this guy and that they were moving way too fast. Ruth insisted that she could take care of herself and followed through with the move. After that, Deborah said that she never saw her sister again. As investigators looked more into Ruth and her possible relatives, they found out that she had been married at the time of her death to a man named Trampas Vaughn. He was her second husband and had spent time in prison before his marriage to Ruth. As you can imagine, police were eager to speak with him, but it was quickly revealed that he had died in California in 2017. The Spokane Police Department said that they consider him to be a suspect because he had not reported Ruth missing. Ruth's first husband is still living in Washington, where he had been cooperating with investigators. This case is still open and being investigated. I hope someday in the future we are able to be in the position where Ruth and her family will finally get justice. Ruth is buried in Fairmont Memorial Park in Spokane, and a new marker has been placed where she was previously in an unmarked grave. A sergeant with the Spokane Police Department named Zach Stormont said, "I still have hope that we will put the final pieces together on who needs to be held responsible for this. I think there are people out there that know things that can talk to me about that, and we'll get there someday." This was such a tragic case to go on for so long and just so heartbreaking for her family that had to wait so long for answers. Just very, very sad. Let me know your thoughts on this case. And with that, that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.